On January 29, 2026, at the Australian Open in Melbourne, world number one Aryna Sabalenka walked to the net out of pure habit, only to realize there was nothing for her to walk towards. The traditional post-match handshake had been quietly suspended before her semifinal against Elina Svitolina, and in that split second, Sabalenka went from a dominant two-set winner to the central figure in a rules experiment that many insiders say came dangerously close to defining her career. The scoreboard said 6-2, 6-3 for Sabalenka in the Australian Open 2026 semifinal, but the moment everyone will remember is the missing handshake, the pre-recorded announcement, and the way an invisible policy decision turned a routine Grand Slam win into a global talking point about who controls etiquette, optics, and punishment on the WTA Tour. Tournament officials made an unprecedented choice that day. Before a single ball was struck between Elina Svitolina and Aryna Sabalenka, the Australian Open announcer told the crowd that there would be no handshake between the players at the end of the match, and asked spectators to respect both athletes. It was a direct attempt to prevent the chorus of boos that had accompanied previous matches when Ukrainian players refused to shake hands with Russian or Belarusian opponents, a pattern that had played out at Wimbledon, the French Open, and multiple WTA events since 2022. Now, for the first time at a Grand Slam, the handshake was not merely a personal decision. It was removed from the menu entirely by officials, codified in an in-arena message, and framed as a protective measure for everyone involved. That might sound like a minor procedural tweak, but in the current WTA 2026 landscape, procedure is everything. The same handshake ritual has already sparked jeers, social media pylons, and formal statements from the WTA trying to explain why certain players will not be participating in a gesture that most fans still consider non-negotiable. When organizers decide to insert themselves into that ritual and dictate what can and cannot happen at the net, they are no longer just setting the atmosphere. They are altering how sportsmanship is perceived, who gets blamed when it breaks down, and how easily a player like Aryna Sabalenka can be painted as a villain, even when she has followed every rule and accepted every compromise the tours have asked of her. To understand why this Australian Open 2026 moment matters, you have to rewind to a different handshake that never happened and the boos that followed. In 2023, Elina Svitolina told the world plainly that she would not shake hands with Russian or Belarusian players while the war in Ukraine continued. She said it before playing Victoria Azarenka. She said it before facing Aryna Sabalenka. And yet, after Svitolina walked straight past the net both in Paris and in other events, sections of the crowd booed, misreading her refusal as disrespect rather than political protest. She later said that by standing at the net waiting for a handshake she knew would not come, Sabalenka only made the situation worse and added fuel to the fire in front of fans who did not understand the context. The WTA eventually stepped in. After repeated incidents involving Ukrainian players and opponents from Russia and Belarus, the tour issued a statement clarifying that it respected Ukrainian athletes choosing to forego handshakes and asked fans to understand that the lack of a handshake was not a breach of sportsmanship, but a personal position taken because of the ongoing war. It was a rare moment where the WTA publicly acknowledged that the ritual could not be treated as neutral anymore. Yet even that statement did not prevent crowd backlash in later matches, and it did not stop the awkward optics of one player at the net and another heading straight to their chair, while boos rained down on the wrong person. By the time Aryna Sabalenka and Elina Svitolina met again at the Australian Open 2026, tournament organizers had decided that tradition was no longer worth the risk. This was not the first time Sabalenka had been put in the middle of the handshake war. In Brisbane just weeks earlier, she beat Marta Kostyuk in the final, only for Kostyuk to refuse a handshake and walk off in protest of Belarus's role in the war. The WTA, aware of how ugly the visuals could look, arranged separate photo opportunities for champion and runner-up so they wouldn't have to stand side by side with trophies. The handshake was gone, the shared podium was gone, and the tour was quietly rearranging its entire post-match script just to keep one moment from blowing up online. That Brisbane final exposed something that would become crucial in Melbourne. The WTA had started to treat the handshake not as an automatic, organic ritual, but as a logistical risk to be managed. Officials scheduled different photography blocks, controlled who appeared in which shots, and tried to anticipate where fan anger might erupt. But while they were micromanaging optics, they were not giving players like Aryna Sabalenka a clear, written rule set about what they were supposed to do. There was no official new handshake regulation in the WTA rulebook. There was only a series of ad hoc decisions at individual tournaments. Here, the player can leave the net. Here, she cannot. Here, organizers will announce policy in advance. Here, they will not. At the Australian Open 2026, the ad hoc system finally collided with Sabalenka's own attempt to play by the rules. Officials preemptively told the crowd there would be no handshake and asked them to respect both athletes. For Svitolina, who has consistently refused to shake hands with Russians or Belarusians, this provided a welcome shield from the booing she had endured in previous seasons. For Sabalenka, who has repeatedly said she respects her Ukrainian opponents and is comfortable with the handshake gesture itself, it created a strange contradiction. She was the one labeled by some as the representative of an aggressor state, yet she was also the player walking toward the net in good faith, only to be told by policy that the gesture was off limits on that stage at that moment. The key detail is that this was not framed as a joint player decision. It was not presented as something Sabalenka and Svitolina had agreed on privately, then communicated to officials. It was presented as a tournament directive delivered by loudspeaker before a ball was struck. The message was clear. This is no longer up to the players. The handshake had become a switch that organizers could flick on or off depending on the expected crowd reaction and political climate. And when a long-standing ritual is turned into a policy toggle, the question becomes unavoidable. What happens to a player's reputation when that switch is flipped at exactly the wrong time in exactly the wrong match? For Sabalenka, the risk is not hypothetical. In the social media age, still images and 10-second clips travel faster than any press conference explanation. A slow-motion replay of her standing alone at the net, walking forward, then stopping awkwardly as Svitolina heads toward her chair, can be cut to make Aryna Sabalenka seem like she is demanding something she has no right to expect. Without the full context of the pre-match announcement, the WTA's prior statements, and Svitolina's consistent policy, that clip can be framed as a Belarusian star playing the victim or performing sportsmanship at the expense of a Ukrainian opponent's safety and principles. One tournament decision suddenly has the power to shape how an entire career is remembered. This is the essence of the handshake procedural nightmare. There is no clear line in the WTA regulations that tells a player exactly how to act in this scenario. There is no uniform protocol applied in every stadium. Instead, players like Sabalenka are navigating a fragmented system where Grand Slam organizers, the WTA, and the ITF all have overlapping authority, but no single body takes ownership of etiquette crises. The WTA issues a statement respecting Ukrainian players' decisions, but it is the Slam that controls stadium announcements. The Slam tries to prevent booing by removing the handshake, but the WTA is the organization that will live with the long-term damage if one of its stars is vilified for following or resisting that directive. In the gap between those institutions, a player's reputation hangs. The pattern becomes even clearer when you place this Australian Open 2026 moment next to other recent cases where WTA players have fallen foul of rules that were technically written but inconsistently enforced. Kali Goff has already found herself in the crosshairs of the WTA officiating over things like time violations and locker room privacy, prompting the tour to talk about players' spaces away from competition only after images of her private frustration leaked online and triggered public debate. Sabalenka and Goff have both been cited or threatened under strict WTA rules, from pace of play to conduct, in ways that made many fans question whether regulations are being applied to protect athletes or to control them. The handshake is simply the most visible frontier because everyone can see it and everyone has an opinion about what it should mean. What makes the Sabalenka case uniquely dangerous is the intersection of politics, optics, and precedent. Before the Australian Open stepped in with its announcement, the handshake question was primarily a matter of personal choice for Ukrainian players, backed by a WTA statement that asked fans for empathy. After the announcement, it became something else, a tool that tournaments could use to manage crowd behavior and minimize broadcast controversy. It might feel like a compassionate adjustment, but it also sets a precedent that tournaments can suspend long-standing traditions whenever political risk is high, without negotiating clear guidelines with the players who will carry the consequences. From a governance perspective, that's a serious problem. Players are told they are independent contractors, responsible for their own image, statements, and conduct. They are fined when they skip press conferences, warned when they violate time rules, and sometimes publicly criticized when they show too much emotion on court. Yet in the handshake saga, a player like Sabalenka can do everything right, comply with WTA guidance, and still have her image shaped by a decision made in a boardroom she never enters. The WTA does not publish a handshake protocol for politically sensitive matches. Grand Slams do not outline in advance when they will suspend traditions, but the camera is rolling, and the narrative is still pinned to the player's name. When you look at how Marta Kostyuk's Brisbane protest was handled, the systemic double standard becomes even more obvious. The WTA responded by designing separate photo shoots so there would be no single uncomfortable image of Kostyuk standing next to Sabalenka, two players symbolizing opposite sides of a war. On one level, that is a thoughtful accommodation. On another, it is a quiet admission that the tour's usual scripts no longer work and that officials will bend them on the fly rather than formally update their rulebook. If the Brisbane solution was separate podiums and no handshake, why did the Australian Open need a stadium announcement weeks later? If both were meant to protect the same Ukrainian stance and prevent the same fan backlash, why is there still no clear written standard for players to rely on? For Aryna Sabalenka, the pattern is exhausting. She has already dealt with being booed at times simply for being Belarusian. She has spoken about the pressure of walking into press rooms where every second question is about geopolitics she does not control. She has now won a Grand Slam semifinal where the handshake was removed before she even served, not because of anything she did, but because officials wanted to control the crowd. At every step, she is the constant, yet every procedural experiment seems to happen around her, at her matches, with her image on the marquee. The stakes are not just emotional. Sponsorship deals rely on public perception. WTA 2026 is in a digital era where clips from Melbourne or Brisbane can define a player in markets they have never set foot in. When a handshake becomes the headline rather than a semifinal win, when no handshake for Sabalenka appears in news copy more often than the scoreline, brands and broadcasters start to see her as a magnet for controversy rather than simply a dominant champion. That perception can influence appearance fees, endorsement negotiations, and even how tournaments schedule her on show courts. It is not an exaggeration to say that a single mismanaged ritual can alter a career trajectory, especially when it is the second or third time the same player has been pulled into the same type of storm. So what is the real reason for the WTA snub in this story? It is not that Aryna Sabalenka did anything wrong on the Australian Open 2026 court. It is that in the eyes of fans and some commentators, she was once again placed on the wrong side of a narrative the institutions failed to control. Instead of creating a unified handshake policy with the ITF and Grand Slams, the WTA allowed each tournament to improvise. Instead of educating crowds in advance across all events, they issued statements only after controversies erupted. Instead of clearly empowering players to opt in or out of the handshake without penalty, they left them to navigate an increasingly politicized ritual with nothing but their own instincts and a hope that the crowd would understand. That is the risky procedural nightmare at the heart of this investigation. A handshake is supposed to be the simplest thing in tennis. Two players walk to the net, look each other in the eye, and briefly recognize the shared work of competing at the highest level. But when wars, booing crowds, broadcast optics, and institutional paralysis are all layered on top of that moment, simplicity disappears. In its place is a moving target that players like Sabalenka are forced to hit while blindfolded, and if they miss, even by doing exactly what they have been told, their careers can be reduced to a single freeze frame, a hand in the air, an opponent walking away, and a caption that does not care about the rules that were changed without them. Until the WTA decides to own this issue fully, publish a clear and consistent handshake framework, and demand that Grand Slams follow it, the game will keep producing these career-defining flashpoints. A missed handshake here, a suspended handshake there, separate photos in Brisbane, announcements in Melbourne. Each incident will be treated as a one-off scandal, but together they form a pattern. The pattern is simple. When etiquette turns into politics and politics turns into policy, it is the players, not the institutions, who get snubbed. And Aryna Sabalenka, more than almost anyone else in WTA 2026, has become the outlier caught at the center of that contradiction.